I was 17 when I decided I didn't need God. Nothing dramatically, not with a big moment. It just didn't fit my way of life. The church as an institution seemed to me more concerned with control than with truth. And faith itself couldn't be proven. I was driven mainly by my rational mind. I wanted to study engineering. And for that, you don't need faith. You need equations. But there was something I didn't see at that time. I hadn't stopped believing. I had just changed the address of my belief. And so I started to believe in achievement, in recognition, and in belonging. And in the simple idea that if I just reached enough, once you have the right degree, the right job, and the right external image, the space inside that feels empty would eventually fill. Well, of course, it didn't fill. Much later, in my mid-30s, I started to see that. The values and standards I was living by, they weren't really mine. I had adopted them and inherited them from my family, from the culture and society I lived in, from my personal and professional environment, and from the things that got rewarded. And certain questions I had once dismissed with rationality no longer had answers. Today, I trust in something larger. I don't always call it God, but some people would probably. I sometimes call it acceptance. And it's reflected in the beauty and in the uniqueness of nature and the universe. And it's also the recognition that something moves through us and around us that is larger than what we can control. Now, I don't tell you this because I want to convince you or as a spiritual autobiography. I'm telling you this because it leads directly into what this video is about. Because this is exactly what Nietzsche meant and what Jung spent a lifetime investigating. And because I suspect that somewhere in that story, you recognize something of yourself. There's a passage in Nietzsche's Gay Science, and I guess it's probably the most famous one, and I read it also maybe 20 times. And it's funny because I don't understand it always in the same way. That passage really moves me because it doesn't land in my head, it lands somewhere in my body. It is like the recognition of something that was already true and that I knew before, but that I had simply been very carefully ignoring, or at least I chose not to look at it. The passage I'm talking about is paragraph 125, the parable of the madman. And it goes like this. A man runs into the marketplace in broad daylight and he's carrying a lantern. And he's crying out, "I seek God! I seek God!" And the people around him start to laugh at him. And then he says, "God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him." What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? And I want you to sit with this question for a moment before we do anything else with it. Because the point is, this is not a theological problem, but it might be the most personal question of your adult life. God is dead is not an atheist slogan. Nietzsche is not saying, "I don't believe in God and you shouldn't either." He's actually saying something much harder and deeper. He's talking about the moral order of the West, of our civilization. And that is basically what used to be our entire structure of meaning, that was underwritten by divine authority. It suddenly lost its foundation. Well, the values didn't disappear. Also, the institutions didn't disappear. Neither did the habits of thought, or the inherited sense of what is good and right and worth pursuing. None of that disappeared. But the ground beneath it did. And most people, Nietzsche said, and I believe it's still true today, they haven't even noticed that yet. They're still living by borrowed values and moral standards. Borrowed from their parents or from religion, even after leaving it. And of course from our career culture. From the idea that achievement is the answer to a question they never quite finished asking. Nietzsche's diagnosis is simple and cutting. We have been running on borrowed authority, and the debt is coming due. Now, what can we do with that finding? Nietzsche describes two possible paths forward. The first one is becoming the last man. The figure who shrugs, blinks a little, and says, voila, we have invented happiness. The guy who finds something comfortable to hold onto, who manages the collapse rather than facing it. Don't get me wrong, the last man is not even a bad guy. He's just someone who got tired. And to be honest, most of us, including myself, know what that feels like. The second path is the Übermensch. And we have to be careful here, because this concept has been so thoroughly misinterpreted in history. The Übermensch is not a power fantasy. It's also not Nietzsche as a productivity guru. It is a person who, after he killed God and visited its moral standards, creates values from within, who practices what Nietzsche calls the revaluation of all values. The one who says yes to life without requiring external permission. Creating your own values. That can sound either obvious or frightening, depending on where you stand right now. But let me be very clear about what Nietzsche actually means. To create new and own personal values means deciding what you are willing to sacrifice for. It means choosing which actions are worth doing, especially when no one is watching and no authority is validating the choice. And it means knowing, not hoping, not performing, but actually knowing what you believe is true. And that is harder than it sounds. But for those of you in the first half of your life, the good news is you don't have to know, because the structure provides the answers. The midlife transition is the moment the structure stops providing them. That is not a crisis, how it's sometimes called. It's actually an invitation. Let me share with you a story about someone I worked with. I keep it anonymous, but I'm telling you because it is not an exception. Actually, it's one of the most common things I encounter in my work with midlife professionals. Now, by every external measure, this person had done everything right. He had achieved everything he wanted. He had a fancy title, solid income, family, house, a social standing. All of it was in its place. And then he sat across me and I asked a simple question. What do you actually want? Not what's next on the career ladder, and not what would look good. What do you want? What do you really want? There was a long silence. And what came out of the silence wasn't even confusion. It was the recognition that this question had never really been asked in the last 30 years or so. The structure had always provided the answer before it became necessary. The values underneath 3 decades of achievement were never his. The ladder had been leaning against the wrong wall. Not through bad faith and not through stupidity. It was the ladder everyone around him had pointed to. A borrowed ladder against a borrowed wall. That is Nietzsche, not as a philosophy, but as lived reality. Now, today, the borrowed God is gone. And from there, the work begins. And if you still need evidence that this is not a philosophical abstraction, look at what artificial intelligence is quietly doing to the idea that human intelligence is inherently irreplaceable. In our modern world, many people move to such secular foundations after leaving religion. When that foundation also begins to shift, the question of your own values stops being optional. Nietzsche saw it already coming without seeing AI. Because the structure was always more fragile than it looked like. So Nietzsche diagnosed the collapse. But Jung describes what comes after. For Jung's answer to the death of God is neither atheism nor secular humanism. It is something stranger and more honest. According to him, the divine function does not disappear when the institution collapses. It descends. It migrates inward. So the God image becomes what Jung called the self, which is the ordering principle of the psyche. It's larger than the ego, but accessible through honest encounter with oneself. So basically, what Jung is saying is that we find God within ourselves. And I've seen this in my own dream life, where I find the expressions of my unconscious. And I suspect some of you have too. Sometimes in dreams, there appears a figure that has the quality of light or of gravity. that behaves differently from everything else in the dream. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain itself, it simply is, with an authority that no waking person carries. Jung would say, that is the numinous. That is what you're working with when the external containers have cracked. So he made an observation that I return to constantly. Among all his patients, and he had many, in the second half of life, let's say over 35, there was not a single one whose problem did not ultimately come down to finding a religious attitude toward life. None of them were truly healed who had not regained that attitude. Now, religion does not necessarily mean to sit in the church or following the Pope. It means a living relationship with something that is larger than the ego, and larger than ourselves than what we can explain. It is a true engagement with meaning. Not inherited meaning and not performed meaning, but meaning that has been lived through, that has been questioned and challenged, that has been lost and found again through one's own experience. And I can recognize this in my own story. At 17, I let go the institution and thought I had let go faith. But what I had actually done was change the address. I started believing that achievement and recognition could answer the questions faith couldn't. And it took me 20 years to see that this was also, in a way, theology or a religion. Just a poorer one. Now, if we hold Nietzsche and Jung side by side, Nietzsche is saying the borrowed God is dead. You must create your own values. And Jung is saying the divine function migrates inward. And without it, the second half of life becomes an illness, a neurosis. That might sound like a contradiction, but it isn't. That is the same insight from two different angles. Both of them are pointing at the same invitation. Stop inheriting your relationship with meaning and start building one. And what we casually call the midlife crisis, in both frameworks, is an initiation. The persona cracks, the shadow rises, the inherent values stop holding. But that is not a collapse. That is actually your psyche doing exactly what it needs to do to make room for something real. Now, I want to ask you two questions directly, without any rhetorical framing. What values are you actually living from? Today, right now. Not what you would say in a job interview, and not what you're telling your wife or your children, but what you actually sacrifice for. What actually governs your decisions when no one is validating you and no structure is pointing that way. The second question is a bit harder. Are those values yours? Or did you find them already built, already labeled, already approved by the institutions and people around you? Nietzsche would say that almost everyone arrives at midlife living on borrowed values, because borrowing is for many the only available option in the first half of life. And that's okay. The first half is for learning how to function in the world. But the second half is for deciding which of those labels are truly yours, and which ones you can finally dismiss. Now I want to give you also something more practical and immensely helpful to work with this week. Actually, it is just one more question and a place to put the answer. Take a pen and a piece of paper or your notebook. Not your phone, actual paper. And write down 3 things you invest significant time, energy, or money in. 3 things that structure your week, your decisions, or your identity. And then ask yourself for each one, would you still do this if no one ever knew you were doing it? No status, no recognition, no validation from any external authority. Just you and the thing itself. What survives that question is yours. What doesn't? That's worth looking at honestly. Because what you find in these answers deserves honesty, not judgment. And what you will find is the beginning of reevaluation Nietzsche was pointing at. If you want to go deeper with this, if you want a structured way to understand which patterns are actually driving your decisions, which are inherited and which are genuinely yours, I've built something for exactly that. It's called the career archetype test, grounded in Jungian psychology. It won't tell you what to do, but it will show you what is already running your life. If you're ready to stop borrowing your values and start building your own, the link is in the description. The madman in Nietzsche's parable doesn't end with answers. He ends with a question. What festivals of atonement shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? He throws his lantern on the ground, and he leaves. What has moved me about this image, what I have never read as nihilism, is the seriousness of the question beneath it. The madman is not celebrating. He is grieving something real and asking with true urgency, what do we build now? And Jung's answer, the one that occupied him for a lifetime, is that you build inward. What moves into the ruins of the borrowed God is not emptiness, it is depth. And the second half of life is not a slow descent from the heights of achievement. It is much more, but also something very different. It is the first time many of us have the real chance to live in true contact with who we actually are. And I know that not only from theory. At 17, I let go of a God I had never really claimed as my own. And then in my 30s, I began to see that I had also borrowed the values that replaced him. Then slowly, through the inner work, through the silence, and through the questions that have no easy answers, I began to understand that God is everywhere. In us and around us, in the beauty of the nature, in the wonder of the universe, in the acceptance of what we cannot control. That is not a return to what I left at 17. It is something I built, slowly, honestly, and still unfinished. My borrowed God is gone. The question is not whether this is true. The question is what you are building on the ruins. If this question is steering something in you right now, that's not a coincidence. And the archetype test won't answer it for you. But it will show you where to start looking. Link is below. See you in the next video.